We're also gonna like ignore the fact that I said I was gonna post one video a month, and then I proceeded to not post anything in the second month of the year. I also needed to charge my phone because my battery was at 17%, so now we're plugged in while set up on like the shitty tripod. It's a whole thing. We love professionalism around here. Anyway, so today I am bringing you a recent reads video, basically everything I've read so far this year, which comes out to 10 books and 1 short story. So according to Storygraph, 11 books, and I'll take that. It puts me further ahead of my goal, so you know, we're cool with it. Of those 11 items, 1 of them was a reread, so I'm doing really well on my not rereading things goal of the year so far. And I've actually had a surprisingly good 2024 so far as reading goes. I have had an average rating of 4.06 stars for everything that I've read. I've, I guess, just done a really good job of picking things that I'm actually in the mood for, which is awesome. So I'm just gonna run through the books I've read, tell you a little bit about them, give you a star rating, direct you to another video if there's more information to be had. You guys know how these work probably better than I do at this point. Also, as usual, I'm just gonna throw pictures up on the screen because a lot of these I read digitally and I don't have physical copies, and even the ones I do have physical copies of, quite frankly, I don't feel like digging them out and holding them up right now, so we're just like not gonna do that, and you know, that's fine. Okay, so first thing I read, I actually finished on January 1st this year, and that is Crank by Hopkins, which is a YA book told in verse. So it's like a novel but written in poetry, and it is about a teenage girl who gets addicted to crystal meth. And I thought this was interesting. It was very like harrowing, as those stories kind of tend to be. But I did learn, like after reading it, that Hopkins did write it based on her actual real life daughter and published these stories without talking to her daughter about it first. And I don't love that. That feels a little icky to me. I did give the book 3 stars overall, but I think I would probably lower that rating having found that out, and having found out that that daughter actually has a YouTube channel where she's sort of taken it upon herself to tell her own story. I'll link it below. It's actually pretty cool. Second thing I read was Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. This is the second Stephen Chbosky book that I've read because I believe it is only the second full-length novel he has published. This is very different from his other book, Perks of Being a Wallflower, though. This is like a Stephen King-esque horror story about a child and his mother who move into a home, and he starts hearing a voice of like an imaginary friend, and this friend convinces him to build a treehouse in the woods, and then people in the town all start going crazy. I really enjoyed this. It was a very like religious based horror book, so if that's something that bothers you, I wouldn't recommend reading it, but I've read a lot of Stephen King and I grew up in the Catholic Church, so for me, that's perfectly fine to read about. I will say it moved a little slow at certain points. And like some of that was to build atmosphere, but some of it I just think they probably could have picked up the pace like a little bit. So I did give it 3.5 stars, which is a above average rating for me for sure, but definitely like not among my favorite horrors of all time. Book 3, I reread, this is my one reread of the year, The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter by Theodora Goss. This is a story about some young women in like Victorian times, and they are all characters based on classic horror or sci-fi stories. I've talked about this book in the past. I'll link a couple of videos. I don't want to go into too much detail about it here because I've got a handful of things to get through and we don't need to rehash it again. But I really, really like it. It's a feminist twist on some more classic stories that were, most of them, written by men. And it's like a sci-fi horror mystery series, and it's got like a really good atmosphere. It's a good time, and if you haven't read it and it sounds interesting to you, I would definitely recommend that you check it out. I gave this the same rating I gave it the first time, which is 4 stars. Next, we have A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, and then followed immediately by Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers. These are the 2 to-date books in the Monk and Robot series that she has written. And these are like a cozy sci-fi series about a distant future where humanity has left Earth and they're living on a distant moon, and they have built robots, and then the robots gained sentience, decided they didn't want to serve humans anymore, went off to live on their own. And then centuries passed, and later on, one of the robots comes back to kind of see how humanity is doing and like what they've been up to since the robots left. And that robot is named Mosscap, and it befriends a T-Monk named Sibling Dex, and they go off on a quest together, and it's sort of a quest of self-discovery for both of them, and it's just wonderful. I talked about this really a lot in a vlog that I posted, and I'll link it above, below, somewhere. I'll link it if you want to see my thoughts sort of as I was reading these, but it was wonderful. I gave the first book, Psalm for the Wild Built, 4.5 stars, and I gave Prayer for the Crown Shy 5 stars. Next, we have Girls to the Front, the true story of the Riot Girl movement by Sarah Marcus. And this was an interesting and fun read. Definitely kind of like a feminist music history book about the Riot Girls and like how the movement formed, some of the different bands in the movement, like what that looked like, why some people sort of resisted that label. All sorts of things, sort of a rise and fall kind of situation. And I thought it was really interesting as somebody who listens to a lot of those like Riot Girl bands, and also as somebody who is kind of a music dork and a feminist angry girl myself. I will point out that there was some writing in this, and I'm not sure if it's 100% reflective of the subjects of the book or if it's reflective of the author's own view, but there was some stuff in there that was a little biphobic, and I didn't love that. And it came up like a bunch of times in the book where they were talking about how like most of the girls identified as bisexual, but like only dated men, or like, you know, real queers, not the bi with a boyfriend type. And that doesn't sit great with me, and I don't love it. So that sort of took me out of it a little bit. But outside of that, it was a pretty good comprehensive history of like that time in music. And I would recommend it if that sort of like vaguely biphobic stuff wouldn't bother you, or if you think you can look past it to read it. I did not rate this one because as far as like nonfiction goes, if it's a non-narrative nonfiction, I don't tend to rate those because it's more about like how I felt about the subject matter, and that's not usually something that the person who's writing it has any control over. So I did not rate it. Next on the list, we have the short story that I read, which is Diary of an Ass Can by Andy Weir. This is a prequel short story that goes with The Martian. So it's like Mark Watney's diary after he's chosen for the Ares mission to Mars, and sort of as he's preparing to leave. And like, having read The Martian and loving it as much as I did, it was fun to read this and like find the little bits of foreshadowing that get thrown in there. And I enjoyed it. It's like, 5 pages long. It's super short. I found it available for free online, so if you want to read it, it's definitely easy to track down. I can try to remember to link it below. But I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells, which I have read so many like retellings or like alternative tellings of The Island of Dr. Moreau, and I had not read the actual classic, so I decided it was time to fix that. So I read it, and I really had an interesting reading experience with that one. Like, I enjoyed it, but also didn't enjoy it, and I know that that's kind of what H.G. Wells was going for. Like, it's super, super uncomfortable to read some of the things that happen in that book. Trigger warning for, like, animal cruelty, and frankly, racism, because it is unfortunately a product of the time in which it was written. But, like, yeah, it was an interesting discussion of, like, genetic modification and how far is too far, and like the Ian Malcolm Jurassic Park thing of like, you were so focused on whether or not you could that you didn't stop to think about whether you should, that kind of thing. But it's really like kind of stuck with me since I finished reading it. I initially gave it 4 stars, but I might go back and bump it up to 4.5 because it's been like a month and some change since I read it, and it's still like really wormed into my brain. So that means something, right? Next we have Page Boy by Elliot Page, which is Elliot Page's memoir, published I believe last year. It tells the story of his childhood and early life, his coming up in Hollywood, and his coming out initially as a queer woman and then eventually as a trans man, and how like being somebody in the public eye sort of impacted that process and all of the internal stuff that he had to go through in reaching that point himself. And it was like heartbreaking, but also really uplifting. It ended in a really good place, and you know, I don't know, it felt like a very positive book overall, even with some of the harder subject matter. This is a more narrative nonfiction as opposed to those non-narrative nonfiction. So this was about somebody's personal experience. And while I do think it's a little weird to rate somebody's personal experience, for me with those, it's more about like, did I feel in some way moved by the subject matter? So I do rate memoirs. I make the rules here. I do what I want. So I did rate Page Boy 4.5 stars. Next, we have another nonfiction, which is Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology by Deirdre Cooper Owens. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It sort of tells the story of the beginnings of gynecology in the US, which is, of course, largely the result of enslaved women being experimented on by men who had zero medical training, who just decided they were doctors and that they were going to do these experiments and these horrible, horrible things to these women. And the women have gone unrecognized throughout history. They had really difficult lives afterwards. And this book was sort of a way of recognizing these women's, like the way these women's struggles, their suffering, and also recognizing them for the contributions they've made to science. Again, non-narrative, non-fiction, and also very, very hard to read about. So I did not rate this one, but it's a fascinating piece of history, and it's also something that I think is important to read if you are a person who has a uterus. And honestly, even if you're not. And then last but certainly not least, I read Artemis by Andy Weir. I read this for the Alphabet Roundtable read that's taking place on the Literary Gladiators channel. I believe the videos are going to be posted on March 9th, so I will link that channel so you can check it out if you're feeling froggy. The way the Alphabet Roundtable read works is that Josh over at Literary Gladiators assigned people a letter, and then they had to read and then review or discuss, make a video to post on that channel reviewing or discussing any written work that started with that letter in the alphabet. And I got the letter A, so I read Artemis by Andy Weir, and I enjoyed it. I did not enjoy it as much as I enjoyed The Martian. I'll say that outright. And I think that's kind of the general consensus of people who've read both. But I did really enjoy it. I thought it was kind of cool that, so his first book, The Martian, explored, it was just a man versus nature, survival story. Whereas Artemis is an action mystery thriller story that takes place on the moon, where you're kind of rooting for the criminal. And I had a good time reading it. It was a quick read. I would recommend it if you enjoy sci-fi, especially if you enjoy sci-fi that looks at real world issues through that sci-fi lens, which, as you guys know, if you've watched my channel for a while, is something that I personally really appreciate. I gave that one 4 stars. So that is all of the things I have read so far in 2024, which is pretty cool. So let me know if you've read any of these, what you thought of them, if any of them sound interesting to you, what you read earlier this year that's really sticking out in your mind, because I'm always looking for new stuff to read. And otherwise, just, tell me a joke, tell me about your day, talk to me in the comments, and I hope you all have a great day.